Blessed is the one, or happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. The wicked are not so, but are like chaff that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. This psalm is a psalm about obedience, and it was assigned to me by my professor for this sermon. So I know that some of you are thinking that I'm an unreliable narrator on this topic because I maybe have never meditated on a law a day in my life. So I just want to give you some encouragement that I will give the reminder that this law that we're talking about is, of course, not an ordinary law. And whether you're a person who tends to follow rules or a person who resists being told what to do, this psalm is for you. And the law that we're talking about maybe was understood by the psalmist as including all of Torah, but others have interpreted it that if that's too complicated and confusing, they talked about all of Torah being summed up in the love of God and love of neighbor, and that's the basis for all the Torah. And then later Christian communities came to believe that really the law is just simply living into that rule of love, and that's all you really need. Paul talks about the law of Christ and tells us that the law of Christ is fulfilled by bearing one another's burdens. The psalmist describes obedience or faithfulness to the law as meditating on and delighting in the law. And the prophet Jeremiah also riffs on this psalm extensively, and he uses the words to trust or to hope in. And when we're thinking about meditating on, delighting in, trusting, and hoping in love, I think that's something that we can maybe start to open our minds to, no matter what our personal relationship is to ordinary laws or what our personality type is. This is not an ordinary law. The psalmist speaks of us becoming like a tree planted by the waters, that through faithfulness, we will become like trees. I can imagine those waters as rapids, representing the dangers and adversities of life that we might face. And I can also imagine those waters as the source of life, which is God. And our modern minds, we might separate those things. We separate the hardships that we face from our idea of who God is and what the nature of God is, so that we can imagine a life where both these things are possible. A life where we could stay on the dry, safe shore and avoid life's hardships and still know God. But for the ancient psalmist, our Creator wasn't separate from the conditions of life. And even as modern Christians, we might also see that in our pursuit of worldly power or what we might consider safety, often we're led away from the heart of God. And by taking up our cross, we access life. The psalmist says that through obedience, we will become like a tree planted by these terrible waters. I wonder what the quality is of a tree that the psalm is saying we will become like. Thomas Merton says that a tree gives glory to God by being a tree. For in being what God means it to be, it is obeying God. It consents, so to speak, to God's creative love. It is expressing an idea which is in God and which is not distinct from God, from the essence of God, and therefore a tree imitates God by being a tree. We are like trees in that we are also created as an idea that is in God and that is not apart from the essence of God, but we're different from trees because we're also born with a strange impulse that trees don't have. If trees were created by human beings, they would look like this. This is actually a real artifact of a tree that's created by human beings. This is a Lego Minecraft tree. And as you can see, it's rather different than the trees that God has created. But those of us, some of us are a little bit further on our faith journey. And so we've really started to imagine what it might look like to be more obedient to God and living in God's power. And so we can imagine being a real tree made out of wood and with sap running through us and with our roots in the earth. And so when we picture what faithfulness looks like or what the psalmist is meaning, we might picture ourselves like this. In controlled conditions with consistent results. Is still a limited vision of what I think that God has for us in faithfulness. Because when God created trees, God imagines trees like this. You can see at the bottom of this tree, if you have really good eyes, there's actually a little person down there at the bottom. And God created trees also like this. These trees formed this way because there's Arctic winds going on them, and they can survive those conditions by putting themselves sideways. And this, and this, and this. Who can understand the form of a tree? It doesn't look like it has an order that we can identify, but everything about a tree is ordered for one purpose. Its catkins and its bark and its acorns, and whether it grows down and bends over or grows up really tall or grows really wide and shallow, it's all ordered around reaching for the source of life, which is water, and standing in the glory of the sun. And so we can imagine that we could be formed that way as well. But we don't know what it will look like. We don't know what faithfulness will look like because we don't know what conditions we will face as we reach towards God. Some trees communicate with one another through fungi in the earth. And they can give nutrients to one another that way. And sometimes trees that live in fire-prone areas put their seeds in the ground, and the seeds are covered with a coating that protects them, and until a fire comes, they can't create new life. But we're different than that, because we have this impulse that sometimes pulls us away from the waters, that sometimes pulls us away from what gives life to us, because we fear the power of the living waters. We fear that we'll be swept away, and we can't stand that power for some reason. We fear that a fire will come and consume us. But in fact, we can't learn to resist fire unless we can put our roots down into that power of the living waters. When we encounter this fear, one thing that we do is we seek the wrong kind of power. We seek the wrong kind of power, like maybe we put our hope in political leaders, which gets us really focused on like what the next election cycle will be, because we feel if we win this election cycle, then we'll finally be able to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish and be safe and be powerful. And we might lose sight of everything else and be subject to manipulation by other people. We might seek approval from other people, and we become like a diseased tree that's trying to suck resources from something that really can't support the fullness of what we're meant to be, can't support our growth. When we encounter power that scares us or conditions that scare us, we might drink more, or we might cope in all kinds of ways. We might seek all kinds of different powers in this world. And when Jeremiah refers to this psalm, he says that we shouldn't trust in mortals. And he says that we shouldn't trust in other people at all. And we find that on the other hand, when we are faithful and are rooted in God's power, our obedience isn't forming us for social conformity. It's rooting and nurturing us in God's power in the face of adversity. Jeremiah goes on to say, don't even trust your own hearts. Why should we not trust our own heart? But if we trust our own heart, we might imagine ourselves growing into this. When what God has for us is this, or this, or this. We fundamentally misunderstand our own nature when we imagine ourselves as the way that humans create things. We imagine ourselves as seasonal, as chaffy. We think that if we're ever thrown into a fire, we will burn up and burn all away. But a tree, in its faithfulness, remembers everything that's ever happened. We also remember things that have happened to us. We also carry in our bodies memories of the conditions we've experienced in our lives. A tree might say, here's a fire that happened in 1963, and I had to change my shape, and I had to make my bark thicker to withstand it. But the memory of a tree doesn't just look backwards. The memory of a tree can also plant that seed that lies waiting until a fire comes to burn its outer parts off so a new life can grow. You might be that kind. This psalm is thousands of years old. And like a seed, it carried into now. It carried into in the 18th century was adapted to a spiritual, and that spiritual was adapted into a folk song, and that folk song was used in movements that of people who were resisting fascism in Spain, and it was adapted again and used in movements of people who are resisting poor working conditions and farm workers in the United States. And it was used in the civil rights movement. And all of that was in the DNA of this psalm that was carried over to us, demonstrating the kind of memory that this psalmist might have known a tree carries. And when we're faithful, we also remember in that way, not only looking forward, not only looking backwards, but also looking forward, not only carrying our memories of what we've experienced, but looking into the future. This psalm reminds us that our true power resides not in worldly resources or from other people or even from ourselves, that our true power resides in God. And through trusting in the way of love, through dedicating all of what we have and who we are and how we're created to the risks that that faithfulness requires. God is also faithful. We're promised that we'll be resilient through God's power to grow into our true form. And we don't know what that form will look like. But we can trust God, that God knows, and that God will create us for whatever is needed. I pray peace for you this Advent season, that you trust in that power. May you trust God. In the words of Isaiah, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you.